want you to think about something before we go any further. The Enola Gay did not arrive over Hiroshima unannounced. Weather reconnaissance planes flew over the city that morning before the bomb run. The Japanese air defense network tracked incoming aircraft. Sirens had already sounded and been stood down by the time the Enola Gay made its approach. Because the radar signature appeared small, appeared non-threatening. But some of the people on the ground that morning were not watching the Enola Gay. They were watching something else. Something that had been there longer. Something that held position over the city in a way that no propeller-driven aircraft in 1945 could have managed. And when the Enola Gay finally appeared on the horizon, those other things left. Quickly, deliberately. Several people saw this. Some of them wrote it down. This is what they wrote. Hiroshima on the morning of August 6, 1945, was not a city bracing for the end of the world. It was a city making breakfast. That is the detail that stays with you when you read the survivor accounts closely. Not the military installations, not the troop movements, not the strategic value that made Hiroshima the target it became. What stays with you is the ordinary texture of that morning. The smell of rice cooking on low heat. Women in cotton work trousers cycling to the munitions factories before the heat of the day arrived. Children already awake, already restless, gathered near windows and doorways because the air raid sirens had sounded earlier and then gone quiet. And that particular silence after a siren, when the all clear comes and the fear drains out of you and leaves something almost like relief. And that silence had settled over the city like a second sleep. It was 8 in the morning. The sun was already asserting itself. Hiroshima sits in a river delta, 7 waterways threading through it. And in summer, the moisture off the water meets the morning air and creates a particular quality of light, soft and slightly diffused. The kind of light that makes the edges of buildings look almost gentle. People who survived that morning and were asked to describe it decades later almost always mention the light first. Before anything else, the light. The city had around 350,000 people living in it. Military personnel, factory workers, school children who had been mobilized to help with demolition work to create fire breaks in case of conventional bombing raids. There were also patients in hospitals, students at their desks, and a number of foreign nationals, including Korean laborers, brought to work in the city's industrial operations. What Hiroshima was not by that morning was naive about the war. 67 other Japanese cities had already been firebombed by the time August arrived. People knew what American bombers sounded like. They knew the drill, the sprint to the shelters, the wait, the return. The earlier siren that morning, triggered by the weather reconnaissance plane that the Americans had sent ahead of the Enola Gay, had sent people into shelters and then released them again. Some went back to their breakfast. Some stayed outside, looking up out of habit, the way you do when something has already frightened you once, and you are not quite ready to trust the all clear. It was some of those people, you the ones still standing outside with their eyes on the sky, who noticed that on this particular morning, the sky above Hiroshima was not empty in the way a sky after an all clear is supposed to be empty. Something was up there. More than one something. Moving in a way that nothing in 1945 was supposed to be able to move. And they had been there for a while. To understand what those people saw, you need to meet one of them. A 19-year-old on a rooftop 4 stories above the eastern edge of the city. A flask of barley tea in his hand, watching the sky for fires that would never come because something far worse was already on its way. What he saw that morning, he carried inside him for the rest of his life without ever fully putting it down. His name was Kenji Watanabe. He was 19 years old on the morning of August 6th. and he was on the roof of his uncle's dry goods warehouse on the eastern edge of the city because he had been sent there to do a job that no longer needed doing. The job was watching for fires. 3 weeks earlier, the city's Civil Defense Committee had organized rooftop watch rotations across the commercial district. Volunteers, mostly older men and teenage boys, whose age or health had kept them out of active service, took 2-hour shifts through the night and into the early morning, scanning for the first signs of incendiary damage in neighboring blocks. It was practical, unglamorous work. You climbed to the roof. You sat on an upturned wooden crate. You watched the rooftops around you. And if something began to burn, you rang a handbell and shouted down to the street. Kenji had been doing his rotation 3 times a week since mid-July. By August, the rotation had become, for most of the young men assigned to it, a convenient excuse to sit alone in the dark and think. There was little else to do with private thought in 1945. The houses were small, the families large, the pressure of collective endurance constant and unspoken. Up there, 4 stories above the street with the river visible to the south and the Chugoku Mountains faint and blue to the north, Kenji had space. He had told his mother the previous evening that he had his watch rotation in the morning. He had told her not to wait up. He was not close to his uncle. He mentions this in the account he eventually gave, and he mentions it with a precision that suggests it mattered to him. His uncle was his mother's eldest brother, a careful and serious man who had taken the family in after Kenji's father was posted to Manchuria in 1943. The uncle did not mistreat them. He simply made clear, through the architecture of small daily gestures, that the arrangement was temporary and the debt was real. Kenji worked in the warehouse after school and before school and on weekends, logging inventory and shifting stock. And he was grateful, and he resented the gratitude. And the roof was the one place in his daily life where neither feeling was required of him. So on the morning of August 6th, he climbed the 4 flights of interior stairs in the dark, pushed open the roof access hatch, and came out into the last hour of cool air before the summer heat arrived. He set his crate near the western parapet, the side facing the center of the city. He had a cloth wrapped around a pickled plum and a small flask of barley tea that he had packed the previous night. He sat down. He unwrapped the plum. He looked at the sky. He had been up there for perhaps 20 minutes when he noticed that the all clear from the earlier siren had not, in fact, emptied the sky. "I thought at first it was a reflection," he said in the interview he gave to a Japanese oral history project in 1973, the only time he ever spoke about it at length. The only time he spoke about it at all, except once, quietly, to his son. You see things at that hour, when the light is still finding its way. You second-guess your own eyes. I looked away. I drank some tea. I looked back, and they were still there. He paused a long time before continuing. I counted 3 of them, maybe 4. They were not moving the way aircraft move. There was no sound. At that distance, even high-altitude aircraft, you hear something. A vibration, a pressure in the ears. These made nothing. They simply held their position above the center of the city, as if the sky were a floor and they were standing on it. He set down his flask. He did not reach for the handbell. Whatever the protocols said about what to report and what not to report, some part of him understood that the handbell was not the right instrument for this particular morning. He just watched. And what he saw in the next 40 minutes is the reason we are here. The first thing he tried to establish in his own mind, standing on that roof with his flask of barley tea cooling in his hand, was shape. Not what they were, not where they came from, just shape. He was 19, and he had grown up near an airfield, and he knew aircraft. He knew the silhouette of a Mitsubishi Zero against a morning sky, knew the lumbering rectangular shadow of a transport plane, knew the particular needle profile of a reconnaissance craft flying high and fast. He ran through all of those shapes in his mind and discarded each one. What he was looking at did not belong to any of those categories. The objects were disc-shaped or close to it, not perfectly round, slightly elongated on one axis, the way a rice bowl looks when you tilt it. Smooth, no visible protrusions, no wings, no tail configuration of any kind. "I am not a man who exaggerates," he said in the 1973 interview. "My uncle would tell you that. I count things carefully. I was counting carefully that morning." He estimated their altitude at somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 meters. High, but not so high that detail was lost. The light was helping him now, the soft preheat diffusion coming off the river delta. And in that light, the surfaces of the objects appeared to have a quality he struggled to name for the interviewer. Not metallic exactly, not reflective in the way polished metal reflects. More like the surface of still water seen from an angle. The light did not bounce off them so much as move across them, as if the surface itself was doing something, processing the light rather than simply returning it. He watched them for what he believed was between 30 and 40 minutes. During that time, they did not move in any direction he could call purposeful. They shifted, small lateral adjustments, a slight rise, a slight descent. The movement reminded him, and he used this comparison himself, of a paper lantern on a very gentle current of water. Present, stable, unhurried. Whatever these objects were doing above Hiroshima that morning, they were not passing through. They were not in transit. They were there with the specific quality of something that has arrived at its intended destination and is waiting. He did not call down to the street. He thought about it. There were civil defense personnel at the corner below. 2 older men he recognized from the neighborhood. He could have shouted to them. He chose not to, and then when the interviewer asked him why, he was quiet for a moment before answering. "Because I did not want them to look up," he said. "I cannot explain that to you better than that. Something in me did not want more eyes on them. I felt that if more people looked, something would change. I kept very still." This is the detail that the oral history researcher noted in her accompanying report. She wrote that Kenji described his own stillness with particular emphasis. Not the stillness of fear, he insisted, though fear was present. The stillness of a person who understands, without being told, that they are observing something that does not know it is being observed, and that this is a condition worth preserving for as long as possible. At some point during his watch, the object nearest to his position shifted slightly, and he was able to see its underside more directly. He described what he saw there with the same careful, undramatic precision he brought to everything else in the account. There was light coming from the underside, not a beam, not a searchlight. A diffuse, even glow, pale and slightly blue-white in color, the way certain deep water fish produce light, he said, illuminating nothing below them, simply present. And at the center of this glow, directly beneath the object, there was a dark circle. A circle of absolute darkness. Not shadow exactly, darker than shadow. A darkness that seemed to have an edge to it, a defined boundary, as if the darkness itself was a thing rather than simply an absence of light. He stared at that dark circle for a long time. He did not know what it meant. He would spend the rest of his life not knowing what it meant. But he remembered it with a specificity that he brought to nothing else in the account. Not the shape of the objects, not their movement, not the quality of their surfaces. The dark circle at the center of the light on the underside of the nearest object. He described it in 1973 as clearly as if he had seen it that same morning. Perfectly circular, he said. Perhaps 3 or 4 meters in diameter from my viewing angle. No variation in the darkness, no texture, just a circle, like something had been removed from the world at that exact point, and the removal had not yet been noticed. The interviewer wrote in her notes that he touched his own forearm when he said this. She wrote that his hand stayed there for the rest of the interview, resting on his forearm without apparent awareness. She mentioned this because earlier in the session, when Kenji had rolled up his sleeve to show her something, she had seen it. On the inside of his left forearm, roughly circular, pale against the surrounding skin, was a scar. He had never been able to explain where it came from. He had woken up with it on August 7th, 1945, the morning after. But we are not there yet. Before August 7th came, there was still the question of why the objects left, and Kenji was not the only person on that morning who watched them go. Kenji was not the only person watching the sky that morning. Approximately 1 kilometer to the northwest, inside the grounds of Hiroshima Castle, a 34-year-old army sergeant named Hiroshi Mori was doing something that would, entirely by accident, save his life. He was writing a report. The report was not about the objects. Not yet. It was a routine maintenance log for the castle's anti-aircraft equipment, which had been flagged the previous week for a calibration issue that his commanding officer wanted documented before the next inspection. Mori had been told to complete it before 0900. He had started late. He was writing quickly, standing at a secondary supply building on the castle's outer perimeter rather than at his usual post, because the lighting was better there in the early morning and because, as he later told the investigator who interviewed him, he did not want his commanding officer to walk past and see him still writing. He had been at the secondary building for perhaps 15 minutes when he stepped outside to check the position of the sun, his habitual way of judging the time, and saw them. His account, filed the following day and preserved in the incident log, is shorter than Kenji's. Soldiers write differently than civilians. Mori did not describe how the light moved across the surfaces or reach for comparisons to paper lanterns on water. He wrote the way a man writes when he is trying to be believed by people who were not there. 3 objects. Circular profile. No engine sound. Stationary above the central district. Altitude estimated at 4,000 meters. Observed for approximately 25 minutes, and that was the initial log entry. 4 sentences. But the investigator who interviewed him 6 weeks later, after Japan's surrender, pressed him for more. The interview transcript, which sits in the same archive file as the original log, runs to 11 pages. "You wrote that they were stationary," the investigator said. "Completely stationary for 25 minutes?" "Not completely," Mori said. "Small movements, adjustments, but no forward motion. No aircraft holds position like that. Not for 25 minutes. Not in 1945. Did you report what you saw to your commanding officer?" Mori was quiet for a moment. "I began to. I went to find him after they left. After the objects left. And then..." He stopped. "And then the bomb fell," the investigator said. "Yes. So the report was never formally submitted. I submitted it the next day. From the hospital. A nurse held the paper." The investigator noted in the transcript margin that Mori had sustained burns to his right side and a perforated eardrum from the blast. He had been in the secondary building when the detonation occurred. The castle's main structures, closer to the hypocenter, were obliterated. The men at Mori's usual post did not survive. The document he had been writing when that small, habitual glance at the sky changed. Everything was found later. Still on the table inside the secondary building, singed at one corner, otherwise intact. The maintenance log for the anti-aircraft calibration, half finished. The last line he had written before walking outside reads, in translation, as follows: "Visibility good, sky clear, no activity." He had written those 3 words, and then walked outside and seen 3 objects that every instinct and every year of his military training told him should not exist, holding position above the city he was stationed to defend, silent and patient in the summer morning sky. No activity. He never stopped finding that funny, in a way that was not funny at all. What neither Kenji nor Mori knew, standing in their separate positions 1 kilometer apart, watching the same objects above the same city at the same hour, was that they were already inside the last minutes. That the objects had, by some calculation neither man would ever understand, already made their decision. That the departure was coming, and that the interval between the departure and everything that followed would be the detail that haunted both of them for the rest of their lives. They left before the bomb arrived. That is the detail that neither Kenji nor Mori could find a way to move past. The detail that sat at the center of everything they thought about that morning for the rest of their lives. Not the shape of the objects, not the silence of them, the timing. The objects left first. Kenji described it in the 1973 interview with the kind of precision that only comes from a memory that has been turned over and examined so many times it has worn smooth, like riverstone. There was no buildup, he said. No acceleration that I could track. One moment they were there, holding that same patient position above the center of the city. And then the nearest one was gone. Not fast, exactly. I cannot say fast because my eyes did not catch the movement. It was more that it was present, and then it was absent. And when the transition between those 2 states happened faster than the eye has language for. Like a light switching off? The interviewer asked. No. A light switching off leaves darkness where it was. These left nothing, not even the impression of where they had been. The sky was simply empty at that point, the way sky is supposed to be empty. And if I had not been watching for 40 minutes, I might have believed nothing had ever been there at all. The second and third objects followed within moments of the first. Same quality of departure. No sound, no trail, no disturbance in the air that he could detect. He stood at the parapet with his hands on the rough concrete lip and watched the sky where they had been and felt something he described haltingly as grief. Not fear, not relief, but something closer to the feeling of watching someone leave a room and understanding, without being told, that they are not coming back. He checked the sky in every direction. Clear, empty. The river delta light doing its soft morning work on the rooftops below him. Somewhere in the street, a bicycle bell. The smell of someone's breakfast fire. He looked at his watch. It was 8:07 in the morning. Sergeant Mori's account of the departure is starker. He was a soldier, and he wrote like one, and when the investigator asked him what he felt when the objects left, he considered the question for a long time before answering. Relief, he said finally. For perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, I felt relief. They were gone. Whatever they were gone. And I remember thinking that I needed to find my commanding officer immediately and tell him what I had seen before I talked myself out of believing it. And then I understood something. He paused. I had been watching them for 25 minutes. 25 minutes of absolute silence. No engines. No disturbance. And the moment they left, the silence felt different. not peaceful. The way silence feels different when something is about to happen rather than when something has just finished. How long after they left? The investigator asked. Mori looked at his hands. I counted, he said. I was a soldier. We count things. We track intervals. From the moment the last object disappeared to the moment the sky turned white, I counted to approximately 500. The investigator looked up from his notes. 500 seconds, Mori said. 8 minutes and 20 seconds, roughly. They were gone for 8 minutes and 20 seconds before the bomb fell. The interview transcript records a pause here, long enough that the investigator noted it. When Mori spoke again, his voice, according to the transcript, was very quiet. They knew, he said. I have tried for 6 weeks to find another explanation, and I cannot find one. The interval was not coincidence. 8 minutes is not coincidence. They were there, and then they determined that it was time to leave. And then the bomb fell. In that order, in that sequence. He looked at the investigator steadily. Whatever they were, they knew what was coming, and they left us there. Nobody in the room said anything for a long time after that. 1 kilometer away, and 4 stories above the eastern edge of the city, Kenji Watanabe was still standing at the parapet, still looking at the empty sky, still 8 minutes and 20 seconds away from the moment that would divide his life and every life in that city into before and after. He did not know that yet. He only knew that something had been watching from above and had decided, with what felt to him like intention, to stop watching. He would think about that decision for the next 28 years before he finally told anyone what it meant to him. Kenji was still at the parapet. He had not moved since the objects left. His flask was empty. His cloth wrapper was folded neatly on the crate beside him, the way his mother had taught him to fold things. The habit of a careful upbringing expressing itself automatically while his mind was somewhere else entirely. He was still looking at the piece of sky where they had been, still trying to decide what he was going to say to someone, anyone, whether he was going to say anything at all. He heard the Enola Gay before he saw it, a distant, high, unremarkable sound. The sound of an aircraft doing what aircraft do, crossing sky with mechanical purpose, nothing in its engine note to distinguish it from any other plane on any other morning. He looked toward the sound, found the shape. One plane, high, moving with the straightforward intention of something that knows exactly where it is going. He watched it. Later, when he tried to describe what happened next, he found that language had a floor, a point below which it could not go. He said this plainly to the interviewer, without apology. I cannot tell you what it was like, he said. Not because I do not remember, because there are no words that were built for that. The words that exist were made for things that have a scale human beings can hold in their minds. This did not have that scale, so I will not pretend. The interviewer did not press him. What Kenji did say was this: in the fraction of a second between the light and the pressure wave, in that impossible sliver of time that the human nervous system somehow registers even though the mind cannot process it, he had one thought, not about his mother, not about his uncle's warehouse beneath his feet, not about the war or the plane or the weapon he did not yet have a name for. He thought about the dark circle on the underside of the nearest object. The circle of absolute darkness with its clean defined edge. The thing he had described as looking like something removed from the world at that exact point. He thought about that circle. And then the world went white. And Kenji Watanabe, 19 years old, stopped thinking about anything at all. The oral history archive that contains Kenji Watanabe's interview was digitized in 2019. The file sits alongside thousands of other survivor testimonies, cataloged under his name, cross-referenced with his district and his date of birth, and the category that archivists assign to his account. The category is Unexplained Atmospheric Phenomena. Sergeant Mori's incident report sits in a separate archive. Different building, different catalog system. Neither institution knows the other document exists. Nobody has formally connected them. Nobody has sat down with both accounts in the same room and asked the question that both accounts are asking. Here it is anyway. If something was above Hiroshima that morning, with enough awareness to know what was coming, with enough time to watch and then to leave, then what exactly were those 8 minutes for? Were they leaving? Or were they waiting to see? If this is the kind of question that keeps you awake, you are in the right place. Subscribe. There are more of these. There are so many more of these.